This is not just history. This is the untold story of a young captain, a man whose name unsettled empires, whose silence terrified the West, and whose rise became a storm across Africa. This is the rise of Ibrahim Traoré. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who seek the truth. They called him the Ghost Captain. In hidden corridors of power, from Paris to Washington, from Brussels to London, his name spread in whispers, not as a celebrated ally, not as a promising partner, but as a threat, a warning, a shadow that unsettled even the most secure halls of empire. A leaked intelligence memo once described him with chilling simplicity. This man, if left unchecked, could unravel the balance of power in Africa. The man was not a general, not a king, not even an elder statesman. He was young, too young, some thought, to inspire fear. But youth was his weapon, and silence was his shield. This captain from Burkina Faso had risen from obscurity, carrying with him no wealth, no dynasty, no foreign sponsors. Yet somehow he had become a name dreaded in Western war rooms. How could a single soldier in one of the world's poorest nations shake the confidence of mighty empires? The West had reason to be afraid, for behind Traoré's steady gaze lay something no weapon could crush, the possibility of a people waking from decades of submission. The possibility of Africa no longer bowing, but standing. And so, the campaign to contain him began. He was followed, monitored, shadowed by satellites and spies, his friendships dissected, his movements charted, his thoughts guessed at in reports thicker than books. They feared what they could not control, but their greatest fear was not what he had already done. It was what he might do next, because from the dust of Burkina Faso, from the hunger of its villages, from the silence of its soldiers, a storm was forming. A storm that would rise quietly at first, then thunder across borders, shaking foundations no one thought could fall. The young captain had no reason to be feared. And yet he was, and when the moment came, when he made his move, what he did next shocked the world. He was born into silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of neglect, the kind that settles over forgotten lands. In Burkina Faso, villages lay in dust, rivers dried into memory, and fields once green with harvest had turned into barren graves of hunger. Children grew thin, their eyes hollow yet searching. Mothers carried pots with no food, water jars with no water. Fathers vanished into the mines, deep, suffocating pits where gold and uranium were clawed from the earth, not for the people who dug them, but for markets across oceans. The land bled wealth, yet its people starved. This was the soil that shaped Ibrahim Traoré, a boy who watched the silence of poverty and carried it with him. A boy who saw the world divide, the poor who died young, and the powerful who thrived on their graves. But unlike others, he did not run. He learned to wait. He learned to watch. In dusty barracks under the scorching Sahel sun, he trained as a soldier. The boots on his feet were worn, the rifles old and rusted, but his gaze carried something newer, a patience, a fire, a hidden defiance. His fellow soldiers saw him as quiet, reserved. Few knew how far his silence reached. Fewer still guessed what it concealed. But in Burkina Faso, no young soldier could walk free of one shadow: Thomas Sankara. Decades earlier, Sankara had risen like lightning, promising dignity, land, and independence, only to be betrayed, shot, and buried by his own. His ghost lingered in the streets, in the stories told by elders at night. Ibrahim grew up under that ghost. He studied Sankara not as a hero, but as a warning, a man too honest, too bold, too unwilling to bend. The boy who became a captain understood. In Africa, truth could kill faster than bullets. Far from Ouagadougou, in the glass towers of Europe, men in tailored suits sat before projection screens. On those screens appeared a name: Ibrahim Traoré. At first, he was nothing more than a statistic, one among thousands of junior officers. But as villages whispered of his discipline, as soldiers repeated tales of his stubbornness, intelligence files grew thicker. In Brussels, a NATO briefing raised a question: what does this captain want? In Paris, a general frowned at reports. His loyalty is uncertain. In Washington, The CIA ran scenarios. If his influence spreads, resource access could be at risk. Soon, he was no longer a name in a file. He was a figure to be tracked, dissected, contained. Burkina Faso's agony deepened. The International Monetary Fund arrived with numbers, contracts, and demands. Officials spoke in polished words about debt relief and economic stability. But in reality, the deals meant only one thing. The country's veins would bleed gold for the West while its people drank dust. Children died quietly in hospitals without medicine. Soldiers went unpaid. Fields remained barren. But the IMF wanted more, always more. And in villages where people gathered under dying trees, whispers grew. We need someone who will fight for us. The whispers found their way into the barracks. And in the barracks they found Traoré. But within his own house, shadows moved. 3 generals, old and heavy with wealth, watched him with suspicion. To them he was a threat, not only to their power, but to their survival. They met in smoke-filled rooms, whispering of his dangerous potential. They saw the West's fear and decided to use it. If they could deliver Traoré's head, they would secure favor, money, and protection. What they didn't know was that they were already being watched. For in the silence, Traoré listened. In the dust, he moved unseen. Unlike the generals, unlike the IMF, unlike the West, he did not announce his intentions. He waited. He watched. He studied every betrayal around him. He let them underestimate him, dismiss him, call him too young. Because he understood the greatest weapon of the weak was not the gun. It was patience. Burkina Faso's night grew darker. The West's grip tightened. The generals sharpened their knives. And all the while, in the shadows of the barracks, the young captain prepared. What he carried was not merely ambition. It was something far more dangerous. Something the West could neither buy nor kill. He carried the silence of the forgotten. And silence, when it finally breaks, can shatter empires. The whispers turned into rumors. The rumors turned into fear. In the villages scattered across Burkina Faso's dry plains, strange events began to unfold. Uprisings erupted suddenly without warning. A tax official's convoy burned on a remote road. A mining site, once guarded by soldiers, was abandoned overnight. At night, mothers told their children to stay quiet, for gunfire cracked in the distance. No one knew who commanded these uprisings. Some whispered it was the work of mercenaries paid by the West. Others said the people had finally risen on their own. But in the dark corners of barracks, soldiers exchanged another possibility, that Captain Traoré's shadow was behind it all. The truth was more complicated. He did not need to start these fires. The hunger, the rage, the despair, they had been there for years. All he had to do was stand still, silent, watching, while the flames spread on their own. The world thought he moved them. But in reality, the people were moving toward him. The International Monetary Fund pressed harder. Their officials, dressed in clean suits, flew into Ouagadougou with charts and contracts. They spoke of reform, of progress, but every paper they signed chained Burkina Faso deeper to debts it could never pay. The IMF wanted gold. They wanted uranium. They wanted to strip the country down to its bones and leave its people to starve. And yet in their meetings, Traoré's name kept appearing, not in the documents, but in the conversations, a shadow they could not ignore. This man, one advisor said in private, is not just a soldier. He is an idea. And ideas are harder to kill. The pressure grew unbearable. Sanctions were whispered. Loans withheld. Aid cut off. And in the streets, the suffering sharpened. Mothers carried babies too weak to cry. Fathers buried sons in shallow graves. Fields lay empty, while foreign companies filled trucks with gold dust and uranium ore. Every ounce that left the country made the silence heavier. Every ounce made the people's hunger grow. And as the hunger grew, betrayal crept closer. Inside the military's highest ranks, the 3 generals watched the captain's shadow grow. He had not spoken a word of ambition, yet his name was whispered with hope. He had not sought power, yet his silence carried more weight than their speeches. They saw the danger. They knew that the longer he remained, the weaker their grip would become. And so in the darkness of guarded compounds, they planned. They reached out to Western hands. Secret cables were exchanged, encrypted messages sent, promises written in invisible ink. In return for their loyalty, they would be rewarded. weapons, accounts filled with foreign money. Exile and comfort if things fell apart. All they needed to do was deliver Traoré's downfall. But spies are never loyal to only one master. The same messages the generals sent were intercepted. The same meetings they attended were observed. Traoré, quiet as ever, did not move openly against them. He allowed the web of betrayal to grow thicker, heavier, until those trapped inside would hang by their own ropes. In the capital, unease grew. Strange figures appeared in hotels, men with no history, carrying briefcases heavier than they looked. Conversations were overheard in bars where foreign accents spoke too carelessly about stability and containment. Ordinary citizens noticed. Rumors grew. The country had become a stage, and every actor was being watched. But the greatest test was not the generals, nor the IMF, nor the whispers of spies. It was the suffering of his own people. Famine spread. Mothers collapsed in market stalls. Children dug at the dry earth with their hands, hoping for something to eat. Soldiers, unpaid for months, began to doubt. Some deserted, crossing borders into Mali or Niger in search of mercenary wages. Others sat in silence, their loyalty to the flag tested by the empty stomachs of their families. Everywhere he turned, Ibrahim Traoré faced the impossible choice: fight too soon and risk being crushed. Wait too long and watch his people die. The silence that had once been his shield was becoming his burden. Still, he did not move. Not yet. Instead, he began to weave his own web. Quiet conversations with lieutenants in remote garrisons. Late-night inspections in camps where loyalty still lived. Messages passed not on paper, not on radios, but in the oldest way, word of mouth. In a land where technology was a tool of spies, his weapon was trust, and slowly the balance began to shift. Rebel groups that once fought against the state started to fracture. Some laid down arms, not out of defeat but out of hope. Young men who had carried rifles for years now looked to the captain, wondering if his silence was a plan. Soldiers who had doubted began to wait, holding their breath. Villagers who had cursed the government began to speak of him in hushed tones, like a ghost that might save them. But nothing stayed hidden forever. One evening, a coded letter was intercepted at the border. It revealed plans of a Western-backed operation to remove the captain once and for all. 3 names were listed, the generals. They had pledged everything: soldiers, resources, loyalty, in exchange for Western support. The operation was set in motion. The country held its breath. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Everyone knew something was coming. Everyone knew the young captain had been cornered. The question was no longer if he would move, but when. And when he did, the world would never forget it. Midnight fell heavy on Ouagadougou. The air was thick, too still, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. In the heart of the capital, the military compound loomed in silence, its corridors dark, its windows lit only by dim lamps. Soldiers stood at attention, but their eyes shifted nervously. They knew something was coming. They could not name it, but they felt it pressing down on their skin. Inside, a door creaked open. The sound echoed like thunder in the quiet halls. A group of men waited around a long table, shadows flickering across their faces. 3 of them wore the weight of power in their uniforms, the generals who had ruled in silence for years, feeding on the country's suffering. With them sat strangers in dark suits, their accents foreign, their smiles thin. Briefcases rested by their chairs, heavy with promises. At the far end of the hall, boots struck the ground, slow, steady, each step louder than the last. And then he appeared. Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered the room with nothing but his presence. He carried no entourage, no visible weapon, just the calm, unreadable face that had haunted their whispers for months. His uniform was plain, his red beret tilted slightly forward. His eyes scanned the room once, slowly, and then he sat. The silence was unbearable. Papers shuffled, glasses clinked, but no one spoke. Until one of the generals cleared his throat. His voice was heavy, rehearsed, but trembling at its edges. "Captain, you are young. Too young. You do not understand the weight of this nation. Step aside and you may yet live to serve." The words hung in the air. Another general leaned forward, his smile sharp. "You cannot resist what is already decided. The West has chosen stability. You are inconvenient. He slid a document across the table, a statement prepared for the world. It declared Traoré unfit, removed, replaced. All he had to do was sign. For a long moment, the captain did nothing. His fingers rested lightly on the table, his eyes lowered as if considering the paper before him. The room grew hotter, heavier. One of the foreigners shifted uneasily, tapping a pen against his briefcase. Sweat traced the temple of a general. Then, slowly, Traoré raised his head. His gaze locked on the men across from him. And in that moment, without a word, the balance of the room shifted. The generals realized too late what the West had failed to understand. Fear does not always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. And sometimes it arrives dressed as silence. The captain leaned back, unhurried. His voice, when it came, was low and calm. Stability, he said, is not chains. Stability is freedom, and freedom is not given. It is taken, the words cut sharper than knives. One of the generals slammed his fist against the table, shouting for guards. But when the doors opened, it was not his men who entered. It was soldiers loyal to the captain. Their rifles gleamed under the dim light, their faces hard with decision. The betrayal had been complete. Not against Traoré, but against the traitors themselves. The web they had spun was now wrapped tightly around their throats. The foreigners rose in panic, demanding explanations, warning of consequences. Traoré did not look at them. His eyes remained fixed on the generals, who now sat frozen, their power evaporating in silence for 90 long minutes. The confrontation unfolded, not with gunfire, but with words, with revelations, with documents unsealed and betrayals exposed. Each secret the generals had whispered to the West was laid bare. Each plot was read aloud. Their corruption, their promises, their treachery, all dragged into the open, piece by piece, until the room itself seemed to shrink under the weight of their disgrace. One general broke. His voice cracked as he begged for exile. Another tried to fight, reaching for his pistol, only to be disarmed in an instant. The last sat still, staring into the void, knowing his empire of shadows had collapsed. When it ended, the table no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the young captain. He stood slowly, deliberately, and walked past them. His soldiers followed, leaving the traitors in silence. No verdict was spoken, no punishment declared. Their downfall was complete not by bullets but by exposure. The world would finish what he had started. Outside, the city remained dark, waiting. But within hours, news spread like fire. The generals were finished, their plots destroyed, the West humiliated, and in their place, one name echoed through the night: Ibrahim Traoré. The boy who had grown up in silence had shattered an empire of whispers. And yet, the story was not over. For as dawn broke, the question remained. Now that the young captain had risen, what would he do with the weight of a nation? The world held its breath. The dawn after the midnight confrontation came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the sun itself feared to break the silence that covered Ouagadougou. The city was still, its streets unusually quiet. Yet behind shuttered windows and in crowded courtyards, whispers spread like wildfire. Something had shifted in the night. Something irreversible. By noon, the rumors were no longer whispers. They were shouts, songs, chants. From the markets of Bobo Dioulasso to the villages scattered along the dusty Sahel roads, the story grew larger with each telling. The generals who had ruled in shadows were gone, stripped of power, exposed as traitors. And at the center of it all stood one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Crowds gathered in the capital, some fearful, others jubilant. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders, pointing to the sky as if the young captain's name itself had become a star. Youth painted slogans on walls: Burkina Faso is not for sale. Africa will not kneel. Soldiers, once divided, now stood together at checkpoints. Their loyalty sworn not to foreign powers or corrupt generals, but to the nation itself. In Europe and Washington, panic set in. Briefings piled on polished desks, reports whispered of instability, unexpected resistance, and a young officer refusing to cooperate. Behind closed doors, men in suits cursed a name they had dismissed as insignificant only months earlier. They had thought him a pawn, a boy in uniform easily bent or broken. Instead, he had become a storm, and storms cannot be bribed or intimidated. At the International Monetary Fund, meetings stretched deep into the night. Charts, debt figures, and projections meant little now. Burkina Faso had refused their leash. The humiliation burned deeper than the loss itself. For if one nation could resist, what if others followed? What if the silence of Africa was breaking? And indeed it was. From Mali came messages of solidarity. From Niger, words of defiance. From Senegal, whispers of awakening. Across the continent, youth gathered around radios and phones, replaying clips of the young captain's speeches, memorizing his words as if they were scripture. He was not just a leader now, he was a symbol. A reminder that courage was contagious, but symbols carry weight. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré sat in a quiet room, stripped of ceremony. His desk bore no gold trim, no lavish ornaments, just papers, maps, and a worn notebook filled with his handwriting. He knew the celebration outside was only the beginning. For every foreign agent expelled, 2 more would try to return. For every debt rejected, threats would arrive dressed as diplomacy. The burden was immense, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He closed his eyes and thought of the faces he had seen in the villages. Children barefoot in the dust, mothers carrying water for miles, fathers working land that yielded little. Their suffering was not abstract. It was the weight of centuries pressing down. And now, history had chosen him, or perhaps he had chosen history. The first months were brutal. Supplies cut, threats whispered, sanctions imposed. Western media painted him as a tyrant, a radical, a danger to stability. Yet the people endured. In the markets, women sold food by candlelight, refusing to let shortages break their resolve. Young men joined militias, guarding their borders with pride instead of fear. Songs spread through the night air. Songs that carried defiance. Songs that carried hope. And through it all, Traoré did not falter. His speeches were not filled with grandeur, but with fire. "We will eat less, but we will eat free," he declared one evening, his voice echoing across the radio. "We will stand smaller, but we will stand proud. We are not poor, we are rich in dignity. And dignity cannot be borrowed, bought, or stolen." The world listened, some in anger, some in awe. Months turned into a year, and Burkina Faso changed. Fields once abandoned began to flourish under new cooperatives. Schools taught not only arithmetic, but history, real history, stripped of colonial lies. The youth, once desperate to flee, began to believe that the future could be built at home. It was not perfect. Hunger still lingered. Roads still crumbled. But the people carried themselves differently. They had seen their chains, and once chains are seen, they can never again be invisible. Across Africa, the ripple grew. Mali declared its sovereignty. Niger stood taller. Guinea nodded in defiance. And in quiet corners of Senegal, Ivory Coast, even Ghana, murmurs of rebellion grew louder. The West threatened, sanctioned, withdrew aid. Yet the tide did not turn. Instead, their arrogance was laid bare for the world to see. The more they pushed, the stronger the resistance grew. And at the heart of it all was the young captain in his red beret, calm, steady, unyielding. Years later, historians would call it the spark of Ouagadougou. But to those who lived it, it was something simpler. It was the night silence broke. It was the moment a boy from the Sahel stood before empires and said, "Enough." And though his enemies plotted, though threats loomed, though the future remained uncertain, one truth could no longer be denied. Fear had changed sides. For centuries, Africa had been told to fear the West, its guns, its banks, its debts. But now, for the first time in generations, it was the West that feared Africa. Feared its unity, feared its awakening, feared the courage of a young captain who refused to kneel. The legend of Ibrahim Traoré did not end in that midnight meeting. It began there. It lived in every child who dared to dream beyond chains, in every farmer who tilled soil with pride, in every soldier who refused orders from foreign masters, and long after his voice was gone, his silence remained. A silence not of submission, but of defiance. A silence that said, "We have endured centuries. We will endure you." The story of the young captain who terrified the West was not just the story of a man. It was the story of a people reclaiming themselves. And so, The camera pulls back. From Ouagadougou's dusty streets to the golden plains of Africa, from one man's quiet defiance to a continent's thunderous awakening, the boy became a captain. The captain became a leader. The leader became a symbol, and the symbol became a storm that even empires could not silence.